Welcome to the Rebranding Christianity podcast. You know, in a time of cultural division, when it seems like every camp is circling their wagons and digging in on their position, our hope is that this podcast will be refreshing. Here, we speak as Christians about the Christian faith in America, which is not all that unique. There are a lot of podcasts that do that. What might be unique is that we admit we've done wrong. We admit that we've gone off path, and we acknowledge that the terrible perceptions that people have of evangelical Christianity in America probably has less to do with media bias and much more to do with our own inability to be known for what Jesus actually told us to be known for: radical grace and outrageous love. The same grace and love that Jesus has shown towards us. But we want to do better. We want to represent Jesus better. We want to see a loving and authentic brand of Christianity thrive in our generation. If that describes you, you're in the right place. Welcome to Rebranding Christianity. I'm Cindy Park.
And I am Jeff Jones. Here in studio with Cindy and I are Mike Hogan and Greg Holmes. Today is actually a sequel, part 2 of a conversation we had with Dwight Jewson. So if you missed part 1, if you missed the last episode, my recommendation is to stop now, go back, listen to that episode, and then come back to listen to this one. It is such an important and rich conversation where we hear Dwight's backstory and how he is someone who doesn't have religious affiliation and is one of the nation's leading marketing and branding experts. We get to hear his perspective really about Christianity, recognizing that from his perspective, grace is the secret sauce of the Christian faith, and anything apart from that is just a distraction. It's a fascinating conversation, so make sure you don't miss that.
Yeah, it was truly a great conversation. And today we're gonna pick it up and we're gonna finish that conversation, and we're gonna shift gears slightly. And Mike, when you set up and you kind of introduced us to Jeff, you talked about, to Dwight, sorry, you kind of talked about how he has helped in political campaigns and stuff like that. And so he's well versed in talking to people from different camps, or even when he has helped big brands reach multiple audiences and try and find ways to draw people together. And boy, what an important time in our history for that to be part of what we do well, to draw people together. And so we're going to ask him, we're going to pick up the conversation and talk about, is it possible to draw people together from opposing sides? So let's listen.
So Dwight, as we think about this and, the reasons, why this has happened in the mission drift, and I know you see it on the corporate side, and maybe it's new people coming on a brand, maybe it's profit pressures. It's a whole bunch of reasons why we see this drift and so on. But it's intriguing to me that it's not just the church, right, that's having this problem. And if I think about the United States, we're in a culture that's, I don't know. I was a little kid, right, in the 60s, so I don't know. But it seems like it's hard for me to remember a time when we've been sort of this divided. As you think about this, and in your experience, how do you view sort of the uniqueness of this time, and speaking to a church that wants to draw people together with this compelling message of grace? What do you think are the ways to draw people together from opposite sides? And maybe even drawing on you've had a lot of, I think, really sage observations from me over the years from your political experience about, drawing people together from both sides. What would you offer on that?
Well, 2 or 3 thoughts. One, I may be a nun, but I'm a strongly spiritually leaning nun with a fair amount of depth of Christian background in my nunness. Mm-hmm. There was a singular figure in church history, Christian history in the 19th century, a chap in Denmark named Søren Kierkegaard. And he was the bridge for me between, traditional Christianity and what became modern psychology, and the fusing of those. And he had many good things to say to us. One of the most powerful things he had to say to us is despair. And he means something a lot worse than depression or being down. It means despair. It means lostness. Is willing to be, wanting to be, choosing to be other than that which the self truly is. right? And if I could just unpack that a little more, despair is willing to be other than that which the self truly is, choosing to be who you're not. And for Kierkegaard, that self choosing to be other than that which the self truly is, in his work, self is both lowercase s, humans, and uppercase s, God, right? And so he, to me, is in that very deep Augustinian tradition of saying, hey, it's easy to get lost in it's all about the actions rather than is and are we truly connected to spirit and what spirit is in our lives, right? I believe that we ought to be looking for always what unites us rather than what separates us. In our world, Mike, the marketing world, we do these studies and we come up with segments or groups of people. And we say, well, we should focus on this segment or this group to quote, build our business. And that's interesting. But what we often don't ask and don't ask enough is, well, what unites those segments, right? What brings them together? What unites them? And I believe deeply that while we may be polarized around our differences about secular issues, about political issues, about social issues, that there's a deeper thing that unites all of us. And that's that yearning for, that connection to spirit, that willing to be what the self truly is. And I would spell that with both a lowercase and a capital S. And that when we engage in conversations that are looking not for what separates us, which is most of our conversation, but what unites us, where we come together, we find remarkable common ground. Mike, you and I are very different politically and theologically. And yet, when we have conversations that go a level deeper, we find many things that unite us. In fact, I would argue that we find that what unites us is what really matters, and what separates us is a diversion. And we come together around those kinds of things. And that's been my experience so often. I have, you're probably my closest conservative Christian friends, but I have many, right? And I find that consistently. How can we have a conversation about what really matters and unites us, and we come together? Jeff referred to this in the book, and it's something I'll attribute to a dear friend of mine. Asking the question, not how are you wrong, Mike, but how are you right? And the urgency of asking that question when I most disagree with you. Right. So I take a second to understand you, where you're coming from, and listening to not necessarily how you're right about the presenting secular issue, but how the underpinning, the yearning for, the drive, the motivation is something that we can find common ground around. Do I believe that if we did a poll and said, would you love to find a voice that united America around a sense of spiritual depth, of grace, of warmth, of gratitude? We'd all agree that that's a voice we want to find and listen to. And that's the conversation we need to have.
Great.
Well, Dwight, as we bring it, maybe come back around to American Christianity and rebranding Christianity, as we think about that bigger goal that we'd love to see our culture come back together, and hopefully Christians should be at the forefront of doing that, not the other way around. I guess I'm asking, are you hopeful that American Christianity will be able to make the changes it needs to reclaim the brand, to get back on brand? As you look at the future, do you have confidence or hope, or what do you think will happen to American Christianity moving forward?
Rahm Emanuel, or others, who knows who we should attribute this quote to, said, hey, never waste a good crisis. this is a time of real crisis for America, and I think it's a real time of a crisis for American Christianity. If this was a brand that Mike was running, and you'd gone from 60% market share, if you will, to 60% and down to 49% with upcoming people, you'd go, "Oh my gosh, this is a 4-alarm fire." Right. So how do we take it on? So the question for me is this going to be a well-used crisis? Is this going to be a time where we go, gee, we're in enough trouble here that we have to question some assumptions that we're all making, all of us on all sides, and ask, are we really finding this fulfilling? Or are we following this more chatter from either side? But that chatter to me is getting a little empty and a little boring. So I guess, Jeff, my answer would be, I think the book is going to be one interesting bellwether for that. Sure. Do other evangelical churches say, hey, you're articulating something we feel? You're articulating something that matters. We maybe have lost our connection to who we are in profoundly deep kind of ways, and maybe linking up to that. And is that going to happen? Is evangelical Christianity and is Christianity going to take this opportunity to find the deep that unites, to ask folks like me, how are you right? To ask folks who are leaving the church, why and how are they right? And where's the void that we can come together around fulfilling? I hope so. I'm optimistic, but I'm a skeptical optimist about that. I hope that can. I hope other evangelical churches will ring you up, Jeff, and say, hey, we're with you. This is right. We need to brush off the things that we've got wrong, that we've got lost, not so wrong, but lost around, and connect to where we're deeply right. And that's hard. Living a life out of grace and love rather than anger and resentment is very hard, right? It's also exactly what the whole tradition's about.
Yeah, love it.
Let me ask one bonus question here, because you talked about how, you and I, or you and Jeff, or whatever, tend to be on, different sides of the aisle, but once we get sort of one level deeper, there's much more that we agree on than we don't. And I agree with that. And you also described yourself as a nun, but sort of a strongly spiritually leaning nun. And I remember you telling a story about talking to some friends up sort of, blue state, Washington, Seattle way about this church in Dallas. And they were sort of incredulous, like, I'm not sure I really believe you. But my question is, as you think about the people who are the nuns who are not the spiritually leaning nuns, what would you say to them that might encourage them that something good is going on here? Well,
Mike, let me answer that and start answering that from a marketing point of view, a brand marketing point of view, right? A world that you and I are comfortable with. And the book was organized around a bit, right? You ask yourself, okay, who's my core audience? Those are people I've already got, right? And I don't want to neglect them. I want to have a deeper and richer conversation with them. But who's the next circle out of people I'm gonna have a conversation with? I read, Mike, Pew Charitable Trust, other people who poll this stuff and who've done research on it, and I think there's a heck of a lot of me out there. People who are strongly spiritual, but have found the institutional church to be representative more of hypocrisy, of rage, of anger. They have difficulty around. And I certainly represent that, but I don't think I'm an isolated person. Mm-hmm. And so how do you have a conversation with your core that, if overheard by people like me, can be compelling? When Jeff and I had dinner in 2009, right, his message wasn't for me. His message was for your church, Chase Oaks. Mm-hmm. We've been using our power on behalf of the powerful, not the powerless. I overheard that message and I listened. That's why I'm here, right? Listen to. So would I start with people who don't have a felt connection to the spiritual? No, not as my first audience. I'd start with people who do. Although I must tell you, Mike, that I believe that to be human is to have somewhere within you that connection to the spiritual. We could have an interesting discussion about the theology behind that point of view. I think what people, need to see, feel, hear, and experience is a voice that comes from grace. That's the voice that needs to be modeled and lived in a really deep way. It's not the church's job to be the supporter of victimhood or the moral police. It's the church's job simply to live out of grace. I think if that happens, perhaps the kind of trends that you see and we all see and that are concerning might take a different direction.
Great. Thanks.
So Dwight, this will be kind of our last bonus question, because I know you need to get surfing and whatever else you do out there. But you made a statement earlier about the institutional form of the church that lacks spirit, that people find wanting. It's and yet I don't believe you're anti-institutional. So when you think about spirituality and institutions or culture and institutions, and I know I didn't prepare you for this question, but talk a little bit about that, about what is there a place for institutions? Because there's a lot of people right now saying, well, we need Jesus, we don't need the church, right? We need spirituality, but we don't need institutions. And would you agree with that? Or is there a place for institutions?
Oh, there's definitely a place for institutions. We as individuals go about and live our lives. The burden our culture puts on us as individuals right now, I think, is intolerable. And there's two types of institutions I'd point to. The first institution is our families, right? And do our families hold us? They're a necessary bridge between us and the world. And then the next institutions are our schools, our universities, our churches. Are they absolutely necessary? There's a very famous psychologist in the 20th century named Erik Erikson. And Erikson, one of his many brilliant points of view is that as individuals, we can't find ourselves. We as individuals, we can't possibly know ourselves. We need others to find out who we are and to have a sense of connection with, that living alone, we're essentially lost. So we need institutions, but we're in a time, ever since the 60s, ever since Watergate and perhaps before, and we wax and wane about this in history, but we don't trust our institutions. Churches aren't trusted, but neither is Congress or our president or just about anything, right?
Yeah.
So do we need institutions as intermediaries, if we will, between us and the world, ways we can find that connection, ways we can find ourselves, ways we can join others around that? Absolutely. But we need those institutions to be deeply connected to what their larger task is, to what their essential task is. The essential task of the church is grace, period.
Okay, and we're back. Man, so many good things to talk about. I want to start off, Jeff, by asking you the question, or just have you respond to the comment, the how are they right question, because I know that is one that has impacted you. You were one of the ones that Dwight had to ask himself that question, like, how is this guy right? Like when he was first, meeting you. But how has that question affected you and your leadership over the last 20 years as you have been grappling with these
Well,
things?
It served me very well, and I'm very thankful for it, because, otherwise what we do is we develop sort of our own little echo chambers of very narrow thought patterns. Mm-hmm. And we talk to each other about people who have a different point of view. and rather than actually listening to those people, right? And so we sort of stereotype what people think, or think they're crazy or they're stupid and we're smart. So we self-reinforce our own thinking, not realizing, blind to our own blind spots by nature, right? And don't realize how actually insufficient our thinking is. And so it's been it served me so well to say, man, I just do not want to be in an echo chamber. So when there's somebody who is different but thoughtful and willing to converse or whatever, that's such an opportunity, right, to ask the question, boy, where are they right, and what do I need to learn, and how can we gain common ground, and that's just humility when it comes down to it, right? We're told to be completely humble in the New Testament, completely humble and gracious to everyone. And it doesn't say be completely humble and gracious to people that you think are reasonable. It says everyone, and so how could there's a reason God says that, right? And so because we need each other, we need each other's perspective. We all don't have it all together. We don't have it all thought out like we think, so we actually need that in order to round out our points of view and our perspectives. And I've seen that I'm on all these podcasts lately and radio shows and things like that, which has demonstrated the breadth of Christianity. And there, to be honest, there were some times I get on a podcast with kind of a strange branch of the Christian tree, where I think, oh boy, here we go. Like this is, in my mind, this is just going to be crazy town. This is the branch that monkeys play on. This is going to, and I'm not going to learn anything from here. And I'm so wrong, right? And I have to snap out of that, because when you have curious conversations with people who come from a different point of view, you realize they actually have something to say and something to add. And in some cases, in fact, the one that I thought was going to be the craziest is pretty extreme, charismatic, Pentecostal kind of person. I thought, oh gosh, this is gonna be interesting. I don't think anything's going to come out of this. That was the one. There's only two. That was one of the two where after we stopped the interview, I said, hey, do you have time for about another 20-minute conversation? Because I just want to learn from something you said that I thought was really... And so that was like the least likely of all the people on the podcast I've been. So yeah, I think it serves us so well. It's biblical, and we become our own best friends. So it's just being teachable, right? Being open. And Proverbs talks about that fools don't do that. Wise people do. Yeah. And so I'd rather be wise than a fool.
One of the things that Dwight talks about is never wasting a crisis. And the last 5 years or so has kind of felt like a crisis, right? Am I alone in this, right, you guys? So how have you guys seen good come out of these past 5 years? Because sometimes it's hard to see that perspective. Or do you have thoughts on the way that we can capitalize on where culture has been the last 5 years?
Sure. First of all, I agree with the sentiment about never wasting a crisis. And I think, to me, a lot of it is just sort of expectations, right? I think so often we look at life as like, it's like I bought this car, everything's always supposed to work. Oh my gosh, it needs gas. That's a crisis. Oh my gosh, it needs an oil change. What am I going to do? And I think one of the things I like about business is that business is about overcoming problems on a daily basis. So you get used to these, and I think it's it's not about, oh my gosh, a crisis happened. It's how are we going to do this? And I do think that the hardest thing to do is to drive change. So, to me, there's a mindset that says, number one, crises are inevitable. Number two, in order to solve the crisis, we're going to have to do something differently. And then number three, how can we use this as part of ongoing learning or whatever to do that? And so I think in that sense, the church isn't different than, in all fairness, business had to adapt to COVID the same way the church did, right? Some did it better, some did it worse. And we all found ourselves doing things that we thought would have been impossible a year ago. I mean, I can remember sitting around at, for example, GameStop saying, Well, we might let the IT people work from home for a little bit. We would never let the marketing people work from home, right? And then all of a sudden, we didn't have a choice, and so we had to solve for it, right? And there wasn't a lot to be gained by complaining about it. We just had to solve it. So, for me, I really like seeing. One of the things I would say I'd like to see the church do better is be more adaptable to change, understanding how we can go solve problems, and not just try. So often I think the church is perceived as the institution that's resisting change and keeping things back for the people who don't want to see that, and we're going to create this world where change happens more slowly or something like that. And I don't think that really works to our advantage. I think that sets us apart from the mainstream of culture.
Yeah. All right, I want to ask actually the whole table here. There was a really interesting quote as I was taking notes to this conversation with Dwight, and he says, "Living life out of grace and love instead of anger and resentment is very hard." Why is that hard? Why is it just easier to live in anger and resentment?
Well, I think it's because we're sinful, self-focused people. So, the Jesus ethic is an other-focused life, and which is actually a crazy way to live, because it means when somebody does something that should make me angry and resentful, they hurt me, they take advantage of me, they persecute me, they whatever, right? Then my natural response is retaliation, anger, whatever. But the Jesus response is different. It's an opportunity to actually be other-focused, to bless them, as Jesus said, to pray for them, to honor them, to do good to them, and which is a very different ethic. So when you have an other-focused ethic, like Paul said in 1 Corinthians 6, he said, "Why are you taking each other to court? Why wouldn't you rather be wronged?" And what he's saying there is, why wouldn't you rather be wronged by someone if you actually care more about them than you, and they get one over on you? Then you're like, awesome. Yeah, that's exactly what I hoped would happen. Which is crazy way to live, right?
That is crazy.
So but that is the Jesus ethic. It's purely in every area of life, an other-focused ethic. That's the radical love that is the brand. And so therefore, every challenge that would normally take us, whether it's a hurt, a slight, whatever, we get to see as an opportunity to demonstrate surprising, radical love that is disarming. That cause people to say, "Dude, why? You should be mad. Like, what are you doing?" And that's exactly what Jesus taught. That is the Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemy, do good to them, pray for them, bless them, but it's hard because it's just that's not our sin nature, right? So there's a lot that has to happen in us transformation-wise to get to where we can live like Jesus and live another focused life.
Yeah.
Mark, I'm really curious to hear if you have a response to that from a non-pastor. That was like such a pastor answer that Jeff gave. Do you have a non-pastor answer?
I think I would just add to what Jeff said. I'm going to go back to a little while ago when you were talking about your granddaughter, and I think you said something to the effect of, it's hard to sort of display that love for other people if we're not feeling it ourselves. And so I think everything's related, right, in the sense that what we want to call ourselves to that, but it really probably begins with just sort of spending a little time meditating on God's love for us, right? Yeah. And so, and I think this applies, same thing, if you feel secure in who you are, if you feel secure in your job, you're more likely to treat people better at work. If you're worried about the job, you're more likely to be on edge with the people. And so I think so much of it just begins with having a proper, I don't want to even say proper, but having understanding of how God sees us. And then I think the behavior that we want can flow out of that.
Yeah. All right, Cindy, before we turned the microphones on and started recording, you were telling us a story about your water cup or something, and we were talking about it. I'd love for you to sort of pose this question again, because I think it was kind of an interesting case study a little bit.
Yeah, it's actually not my water cup. I don't have a Stanley Cup, but I'm thinking about getting one now because
So when you say Stanley Cup, so we're guys.
So we're thinking,
true.
Not hockey.
Not hockey.
How many Stanley Cups do you have?
I want one too.
Not hockey. Stanley Cup is like a water cup.
It's like a Yeti. It's like a little
but
that keeps ice.
But cuter.
Okay.
Yeah,
cuter.
which is important to distinguish.
Right.
But so there was a story recently that this woman, her car caught on fire, and she had a Stanley Cup in the car, and her Stanley Cup survived. And she made this TikTok video, and in the video you see her pick up the Stanley Cup, and there's still ice in it. And so that's incredible. So her story blows up. Well, Stanley gets tagged in the video, and the CEO maybe of Stanley responds, and he says, hey, we're going to send you some Stanley products, but we're also going to buy you a new car. And so then, of course, the public is just like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And I am equally sucked into it. I did not care about Stanley Cups before. I don't have one. My daughters have multiples. But now I'm like, oh my gosh, should I buy Stanley Cup? Because I have such a positive view of the company now. And so that makes me think about what you guys were talking about in the interview with Dwight about reaching the nuns. And so how do we do that practically? Dwight talks a lot about secret sauce and grace, and I understand those concepts. But if we get more granular about it, what does it look like in real life to reach people and change their perception of us or make them care about us at all if they didn't?
So I'll just piggyback on that, Mike. What did Stanley do right that got the attention of someone like Cindy?
Yeah.
Is it just being nice, or what is it?
Yeah, I think I would point to two things, and there's things that we've talked about before. One is authenticity, and the other one's exceeding expectations. And I think, it's interesting because one way, the typical sort of businessman's way of asking this question is, what's that thing there that I can do one time that doesn't cost me a lot of money that's going to get a bunch of people to flock in, right? And in fact, I had a good friend who does these incentive programs and stuff, and he had worked with Chick-fil-A for years, and they have a reputation for treating their people very well and their customers and so on. And he gets a call from Taco Bell, and it was like the VP at nothing against Taco Bell, but they were kind of like, so what's the program? Kind of like, and then he's talking, they're like, it was almost like, okay, so the angle is authenticity. How can we do that for a wall? And so I think, it first began with, you can't just sort of do it out of the blue. And I think if it's Stanley, clearly somebody at Stanley felt like, we're supposed to be trusted, we're standing behind you, whatever. Of course we're going to do this, right? So I think there has to be authenticity to it. But then, so you'd say, for example, if I had whatever experience at a restaurant, I would kind of expect them to apologize, maybe buy my meal, whatever. But if they did something beyond that, then I would say, wow, not only are they serious about this, they're really serious about this. And I can remember a thing that we did. I've heard stories, for example, Southwest Airlines. I read a story about where Southwest Airlines had done something where they kicked a customer off the plane because they were rude to one of their employees. Now you'd see this more nowadays, but it used to never happen. Right. And it was them basically saying, you have to understand our employees are important. Whereas typically you would expect them to say, you're an employee, suck it up, it's whatever's going to happen. And I know when I was at one more story, bear with me. When I was at GameStop, we did this funny little thing called Epic Rewards. And of course, every video game's a fantasy, right? And that's what everybody wants. And we started creating these things. We worked with the game makers to bring the experience of the video game to life. So there was this game called Assassin's Creed, which happens in Italy in the 1600s or something like this. And so we created for one lucky customer who won this, we actually flew them to Italy. They went on this whole tour. We're winning these medieval castles where the people who made the games were with them and so on. And it was funny because it was a simple thing. It actually didn't cost us very much money, but it really captured everybody's attention because it was so much more than you would ever, they knew us as a place to get the game, but to then take it the next step. And I think what Stanley did was they were authentic about it, and they said, if we really want to demonstrate to people that we're behind you, that's like saying, we stand behind this so much that if your cup breaks in a crash or a fire, we'll buy you a new $12 cup. Well, how about if we buy you a whole new car? Right. And that's what I think really stood out. But it wasn't just being nice. I think it was being authentic and going above and beyond.
Yeah, that's great. All right, Jeff, I have one last question. So Dwight talked a lot in there, in order to call people together from multiple sides, we have to be able to not only to sort of ask how are they right, but be able to to see how we might agree sort of below the surface a little bit, how we might be alike, even though we might have a lot of differences and things like that, and how can we sort of connect at a deeper level. And I'd love for you to tell the story. Recently, you spoke at an event, kind of an interfaith event about, or a community event, sort of addressing Jewish hate and Islamic phobia. And you had a pretty interesting experience when you did that. Could you tell that story?
Yeah, it was. So there was an imam and a rabbi and me, a pastor, which sounds like a joke, right?
Beginning of a joke.
Going to a bar. Yeah. But in this case, lately, and I'm time stamping this a little bit, but it's probably be an ongoing thing anyway in Israel and all that's happening, right? So there's a growth of both Islamophobia and Jewish hate, and it's felt very deeply. And so the first to speak was the rabbi, and it was
a community. Like mayors, or the mayors
there were a few hundred people there, mayors and police chiefs and all that were there. And so the imam spoke first, or no, the Jewish person spoke first, the rabbi, and it was, what it's like to be Jewish right now in our community and in our world, and what people are facing, and it was terrible, right? And then same thing with the imam, talked about, misunderstandings of Islam and what it's like to be Muslim and what it feels like right now. And then it was me to get up, right? And it was quite an experience. I mean, one, representing Christianity felt pretty like, man, that's a lot, but what I didn't realize how much they needed to hear from me, since we are still, I know we're moving toward a post-Christian culture, but Christianity by far the biggest religion in our culture, how much they needed to hear me say, as a pastor, I'm sorry. And no Jewish person, no Muslim person in our community should ever feel the way that you're feeling, and just have empathy for what they're going through. And as I just did that, it wasn't just showing empathy. As I'm looking at this crowd, people were emotional about it because they needed to hear. And then I went on and I said, and I want you to understand that we, as Christians, we stand with you. We all want our community just to be different than they are. And I also want you to understand, as a Christian, that we love you. And we're for you, and we see you, and we're thankful for you, and we're glad you're here, because most of the people there were, especially on the Muslim side, were immigrants, which has a whole other thing to it. We're glad you're here, and we want you here, and we're really thankful for you. And then I did talk about how Jesus, the way of Jesus, that we could all, whether we believe in Jesus or not, we can all agree with the way of Jesus, right? Who turned, as Zan Holmes, a pastor here in the Dallas area, used to say in the civil rights era, turn walls into bridges. And the things that separate us, the walls, let's turn them into bridges. And we just talked about how that ended up becoming the theme of the night, is how to turn walls into bridges. But it was just grace on display. Very simple, just showing empathy and expressing acceptance and a little bit of warmth went a long way. And it ended up, after the event, I was there a very long time, because I had literally scores of people waiting to talk to me, to thank me, to ask if I would participate in one of their things and all this stuff. Just somebody to see them and acknowledge and show empathy and show love and grace. It was so it ended up being a very powerful thing, and it shows the power of what Jesus brought to the world, and why people who were very different from him were attracted to him. He was like a magnet to people who were very, very, very different from him. And they loved him, and they knew that they were loved by him. And that's the way we have to be known in culture if we're going to represent Jesus.
Yeah. What a practical way to just like really demonstrate and live out like what we're called to. And the impact not only had on the people that were listening to you, but I know it had an impact on you as well, like to be part of that, experiencing that. So we probably need to stop there. There's so much more that we could talk about, and we'll continue to add more voices to the conversation. Our hope with these podcasts is not to craft arguments so that our side will win. Rather, our hope is that we'll all take steps towards following Jesus from whatever side we're coming from. It's a long journey. Thanks for being on it with us. And join us next time for another episode of Rebranding Christianity.